Hello, and welcome to the March RIV call on Improving Lives Part 1. This call will focus on drugs and devices for metabolic control. Today's presenter is Jonathan Rosen, PhD, Associate Director of Research at JDRF.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and tell you all about the exciting work happening in the Improving Lives program. Improving Lives is one of JDRF's major research priorities, along with global screening, disease-modifying therapies, beta cell therapies, and of course, the training of the next generation of researchers and clinicians. The vision of the Improving Lives program is a world where people with type 1 are not only healthy, but also get to live burden-free lives. Our mission is to accelerate this by having drugs, devices, and behavioral health interventions that can improve not only health outcomes, but also quality of life. The reason we need to be doing this work is that there remain critical unmet needs for people with type 1. There are clinical needs, starting with glucose control, where people still spend too much time in hypoglycemia, which is low blood sugar, and hyperglycemia, which is high blood sugar. There are also metabolic needs beyond glucose, for example, obesity, ketones, and insulin resistance, which are present in type 1 but poorly appreciated, which lead to negative outcomes, and long-term complications like diabetic kidney disease and eye disease, unfortunately remain a reality. There are also major unmet needs related to mental health and quality of life. People with type 1 are disproportionately affected by numerous mental health issues, and these affect hard clinical outcomes like A1C as well. Additionally, everyone with type 1 bears a huge burden of disease, whether it's lugging around devices and carefully monitoring your diet and insulin and all of this. And JDRF wants to do everything we can to reduce this burden as much as possible. We've come a really long way with new drugs and devices that were sort of unthinkable, even relatively recently in the past, but we have a long way to go. And I'm going to be telling you today about the exciting efforts we're making for the future. This cartoon shows the pipeline of how a drug or a device gets from a scientist's idea all the way into the hands of people with type 1 diabetes. I won't go through all the steps, but I just want to make the point that this is a long, difficult path, and JDRF is there at every step of the way. We don't just sort of fund grants on interesting research and then leave them. We have all of the expertise we need with regulatory affairs, with advocacy, with everything to get these products that we support from the lab bench all the way into the hands of people with type 1. In the Improving Lives program, we cover 4 areas, broadly speaking. One is AP systems and their components like CGMs and pumps. Second is drugs for glucose control. This is new insulins and also what we call adjunctive therapies, which are non-insulin drugs that you take along with insulin. Then we have drugs for long-term complications. Then we have behavioral health therapies to deal with mental health issues in type 1. Just because of time constraints, today I'm only going to be talking about the ones in the box, which is our devices and drugs for glucose control. The other 2, long-term complications and psychosocial, I'll be talking about on an RIV call in the future. So I'd like to stop for a moment and take stock of exactly where we are. Today, there are 3 AP systems approved on the market, which is extraordinary. We have pumps, we have CGMs, we have new and improved insulins compared to what we used to have, and we have glucagon rescue that you can take if you go into hypoglycemia. We have a couple adjunctive therapies. One is called Simlin, which is approved in the US, but is lowly adopted. And we also have SGLT inhibitors, which I'll talk about much more, called Farxiga and Quista, which are approved abroad, but not in the United States. This is sort of the starting point. What we're building toward is a future where we have not just hybrid closed loop systems, where you have to manually input insulin sometimes, but fully closed loop systems that sort of do all or almost all the thinking for you. Better, more user-friendly devices, continuous ketone monitoring, better insulins, new adjunctive therapies, and more wide use of the adjunctive therapies we all have. And I'll tell you much more about all of these as we go through the presentation. But the point I want to make is that the real outcome we have for the future is health and happiness. And that's what all of this is building toward. Now I'll tell you more of a deep dive into our strategy and key advances that we're making. So, as I mentioned, if we read this from left to right, we're very interested in developing new and better AP systems, next-gen insulins, and adjunctive therapies. And I'll take you through our work here in that order. Right now, in 2021, there's a thriving market for AP systems. There are currently 3 AP systems currently available in the United States for commercial use, and several more on the way. When you look at the slide, don't take the timelines too seriously. They're based on publicly available estimates from companies about when their products will launch. The point I really want to make is just that the market is robust. We have several products available and more coming. That said, what's next for JDRF's efforts and devices? And I'm going to tell you about a lot of the exciting things we're working on, which are based on what we see as the future for AP systems and their devices. The first is user choice. We want there to be pumps, CGMs, and algorithms that each person can pick for themselves instead of just choosing the AP system as it comes to them already assembled. We also want smaller, less burdensome, and user-friendly pumps. We know that AP systems produce really good outcomes, but we also know that not everyone wants to use them right now. And we think we can improve that situation by making the pumps more user-friendly. We want to transition from hybrid closed-loop systems, which require manual insulin adjustments at meals and other times, into fully closed-loop systems. We are testing AP systems in other stages of T1D. And I'll tell you about some really exciting work we're doing to see whether AP systems can improve outcomes if they're used immediately after diagnosis. And finally, we have a new initiative where we're working on continuous ketone monitoring to prevent DKA. And in the next part of the presentation, I'll be taking you through key advances and things we're doing in these areas. So the first one is our work with the Helmsley Charitable Trust and the nonprofit Tidepool to bring forward the Loop algorithm. Loop is a DIY algorithm that many people are using already. And along with our colleagues at the Helmsley Charitable Trust, we're funding Tidepool in a project to bring this algorithm forward for regulatory approval at the FDA and then commercialization. This is part of our efforts in interoperability. As I alluded to before, we want everyone with type 1 to have the choice of what components go into their AP system. So each person can pick their favorite CGM, their favorite pump, and their favorite algorithm or controller. The other good thing about this project is that when the Loop algorithm is, by bringing it through this regulatory process and commercialization, we'll have the opportunity to collect really good data on how safe and effective it is. And this will also allow more people to use it than just the DIYers. Very importantly, JDRF and our colleagues at Helmsley already played a critical role at the FDA in making sure there's a regulatory path for these interoperable algorithms and devices so that new products can be moved forward quickly into the hands of people with type 1. The next thing I'm going to talk about is how to fully close the loop, which again means how do you make it so your AP system can handle all of your insulin needs without having to manually input at meals and other times. So one main problem that prevents full automation of insulin is mealtime. When you eat a meal, your blood sugar goes up quickly and algorithms just can't handle such a rapid increase. So it stands to reason that if we find drugs that can either prevent or otherwise blunt the rise in blood sugar after a meal, that may be enough to allow algorithms to handle it. And then you won't have to manually input your insulin at meals. For this reason, we support work on a drug called pramlintide, which also goes by the trade name Simulin. This is a drug that's FDA approved for glucose control in type 1 diabetes, and it lowers A1C and mealtime blood sugar. So look at this graph on the right. This is a CGM curve comparing pramlintide with insulin to insulin alone. If you look at insulin alone in the light gray, you'll see a big spike after each meal in glucose. But if you look at insulin plus pramlintide, it's more of a flat line. And this is the kind of CGM profile that we think an algorithm will be able to work with and fully close the loop. JDRF supports co-formulation, which means finding a way to take insulin and pramlintide, which are two separate drugs, and combine them into one vial for one formulation that can be put in a pump. In addition to its ability to close the loop, this co-formulation will also be good for people who take daily injections because it'll help control their postprandial glucose. It's also even good for beneficial weight loss and may have other benefits as well. I don't have time to talk about it, but one other approach we're taking to fully closing the loop is work on ultra-rapid insulins, which, similar to pramlintide, can reduce post-meal blood sugar and allow the algorithm to do its job without manual input. Now I'm going to tell you about the study I alluded to, testing AP systems at an earlier stage of T1D. So the question on the table is, if you give AP systems to people who have just been diagnosed, can they help preserve the beta cells which remain because the disease is young and they haven't yet lost them? If we can extend this honeymoon period, meaning that the beta cells survive longer, people will have long-term benefits in their disease. To get at this trial, we're testing both FDA-approved AP systems in a new onset population, as well as verapamil, a drug that's been previously shown to preserve beta cells in a JDRF-funded study. We're testing AP systems by themselves, verapamil by themselves, and we're even testing both together. And this is sort of an unlikely collaboration between the drug world and the device world at a new stage of T1D disease from the perspective of AP systems. And this collaboration was forged by JDRF as sort of an observer of the whole field who can work with everyone and bring people together. If this trial is successful and AP systems can indeed save beta cells when used in a new onset population, that could transform the way we use these AP systems, which are already known to provide really good blood sugar control in the more established stage of the disease. Finally, I'm going to talk about our new work in continuous ketone monitoring. DKA is not talked about that much, but it remains a dangerous complication of type 1 diabetes. And the risk of DKA is elevated in some populations more than others. We know that people who exercise intensely are at risk, as well as people who take SGLT inhibitors, which is a drug I'll talk about a bit more later. And this risk of DKA represents a major barrier to adoption of that drug. DKA is caused by an acute rise in ketones in the blood. And so what we want to do is make a device which can measure not only glucose continuously, but also ketones. And this will be able to warn people when DKA is approaching because their ketones have reached a certain level. Because this is a CGM device with CKM functionality added on, we anticipate there being no additional on-body or mental health burden associated with the extra monitoring. This is a brand new initiative for JDRF. We're really excited. DKA is a major unmet clinical need that we are really excited to finally being able to address directly. Now we're going to move from devices into the drug space. And first we'll be talking about next generation insulins. The reason we need next generation insulins is that the current commercially available insulins aren't as good as insulin that's secreted from a non-diabetic pancreas. And that's our model for everything. We want to make insulin drugs that work just the same as insulin in a non-diabetic person. And we've identified 3 different ways that the currently available insulins aren't as good. First is kinetics. They're not as fast as insulin being secreted from a non-diabetic pancreas. Second is distribution. In a non-diabetic pancreas, after you eat a meal, insulin is secreted, and the first place it goes is the liver. However, in people with type 1 taking subcutaneous injections, very little of the insulin makes it to the liver. And this is important because the liver needs insulin to be able to modulate your blood sugar appropriately. The third area is glucose responsiveness. When someone without diabetes eats a meal and their blood sugar starts to rise, insulin is secreted naturally. They don't need to think about it. But with type 1, if you take insulin and your blood sugar isn't high, it may lower it lower than you want it to go. You've lost the automatic tuning of insulin activity to blood sugar. And so we are developing new insulins to address all of these problems. To deal with insulins today being too slow, we're making ultra rapid insulins. To deal with insulins that don't go to the right place in the body, we're making liver targeted insulins. And to deal with insulins not being able to tune their activity to your blood sugar level, we're making glucose responsive insulins, which will be only active when blood sugar is high and turn off when blood sugar is low. First, I'll tell you a bit about where we are with URI and LTI, and then I'll move into glucose responsive insulins. So when we talk about our work in URI, we're not talking about small changes or bells or whistles. We're trying to make brand new kinds of insulin designs, which will be fundamentally much faster than the ones that are currently available. URI should be fast on, fast off. This means they come on quickly and then they leave quickly. The reason that's important is that you can get hypoglycemia when insulin lingers in your body for hours and hours after the meal. So if the insulin turns off as fast as it came on, we'll eliminate that problem. URIs will help with mealtime glucose control, reductions in delayed hypoglycemia, and as I mentioned earlier, may allow us to close the loop in AP systems by covering mealtime blood sugar rises so well. And the JDRF program currently supports preclinical research with these fast-acting insulins. Now, as I mentioned with LTI, the idea is to recapitulate non-diabetic physiology by getting the insulin to the liver where it's required to control blood sugar. This will result in benefits for reducing hypoglycemia, reducing hyperglycemia, and may even be good for aspects of metabolic control like lipids. JDRF currently supports projects in liver-targeted insulin, both in the preclinical and clinical stage. And I should add that you can also use implanted devices to achieve liver targeting of insulin. The LTI field is, I think, at a very exciting place with there being multiple LTIs in clinical development and company-sponsored trials. Now I'm going to tell you about GRI, which again is insulins, which are on at high glucose and turn off at low glucose. The idea is that these will prevent hypoglycemia because once your glucose starts getting low, the insulin will turn off and won't go any further. Importantly, another benefit besides preventing hypoglycemia is preventing anxiety over hypoglycemia, which is a very understandable experience that many people with type 1 go through. We also think GRIs will help with hyperglycemia because once people are able to not be anxious about their hypos, they'll be able to treat their highs as aggressively as they would like to. And we think for the same reason, it will lead to a reduction in A1C. For JDRF, improvements in quality of life are just as important as hard clinical endpoints like A1C. And we think that GRI will offer a lot of health-related quality of life benefits, including fewer injections of insulin every day. Think about taking just one injection of GRI in the morning and it circulates in your body the rest of the day, turning on and off as needed. There will be reductions or elimination of carb counting, calculating insulin doses, and just generally thinking about your diabetes all the time. And we're excited to see where GRI is heading next. People often are interested in how a GRI could work because I think when we explain it, it can sound a little bit mystical, but it's really not. And so I made this diagram to try to explain how I think about it. This is one way a GRI can work. Imagine GRI is, imagine insulin, I should say, is a key that fits into a lock. And when it fits into the lock, it lowers blood sugar. So the key to making a GRI is to warp the insulin so it no longer fits in the keyhole at low blood sugar, which is what's shown on the top right. Because that key is kinked, it just can't fit in the lock and lower blood sugar. But when glucose levels rise, the glucose sticks to the key and straightens it out and now can fit in the keyhole. So again, imagine you take a shot of GRI in the morning and the rest of the day, your insulin goes back and forth between those two shapes, the kinked key and the straight key, in line with how much glucose is in the body so that your insulin is only active when your blood sugar is high when you want it to be. So where are we now with GRI? In the aughts and beyond, JDRF provided huge amounts of investment in this field, some financial, but also non-financial. We sort of built it from the ground up. We talked about it. We brought scientists together. We held workshops. We inspired the whole field, and we're now seeing some payoff from that. Eli Lilly and Sanofi have both partnered with JDRF since then to promote research opportunities at academic labs and in the private sector. Currently, Novo and Lilly have both publicly disclosed internal GRI programs, and both have made publicly big acquisitions in the space in the last few years. The JDRF supported GRI projects are currently in preclinical development where we're seeing exciting results in animal studies. And obviously we're doing everything we can to drive these projects forward toward clinical trials. Finally, I'm going to talk about adjunctive therapies for type 1 diabetes. So adjunctive therapies are drugs you take along with insulin, not instead of it, but along with insulin to get better outcomes than you could with insulin alone. And there's two reasons for this. The first is that insulin isn't giving people the glucose control needs, the glucose control that they need. That's why people still have hypos and hypers and so on. Obviously, it's not the fault of the people type 1, it's that the tools that they have available aren't good enough. So we need adjunctive therapies that can help insulin control blood sugar. But the second reason, and this one is less well appreciated, is that type 1 diabetes isn't just a disease of glucose control, it's a disease of broader metabolic control. This means that it's not just glucose that's a problem, but other things like insulin resistance, frequently obesity, lipids, and all of these other things which are important to control and able to get good long-term health outcomes. Insulin can't control some of these, and for some, like obesity, is even part of the culprit since insulin promotes weight gain. So the solution to this problem is to give people adjunctive therapies with insulin to get better results. Here are just a few examples of the kind of adjunctive therapies that we're supporting. I already mentioned insulin-pramlintide co-formulations in the context of fully closing the loop. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about a class we're very excited about called SGLT inhibitors. These drugs lower blood sugar by causing the sugar to move from the blood into the urine, where it can be easily removed from the body when you go to the bathroom. These drugs work very well at lowering blood sugar in type 1, and they have other benefits as well. The problem is that right now, use of these drugs is associated with an increased risk of DKA, which is limiting adoption. These drugs are approved abroad in Europe and Japan, but not in the United States. And JDRF has a great interest in finding ways to allow these drugs to be used safely and effectively in type 1. Another drug class we're very interested in is called GLP-1, where one key example is Ozempic. GLP-1s have been tested in people with type 1 and show benefits and are FDA approved in type 2 diabetes. And JDRF has a major interest also in finding out how this drug class can be used best and most effectively in people with type 1. Those are examples of drugs that are approved in type 2 and we're pursuing in type 1, but we're also pursuing some adjunctive therapies specifically with type 1 in mind, even before they'll be tested in type 2 diabetes. Now, here's a really great example of an adjunctive therapy trial that we're supporting. I talked about single adjunctive therapies like SGLT or GLP-1. This one is doing both, and it's called a triple therapy because that includes insulin. So it's insulin plus 2 adjunctive therapies. It's so important that JDRF support trials like this because we want to incentivize companies to come into the space. So when they see how well type 2 drugs do in a type 1 clinical trial, they'll be more interested in devoting resources for our population. So this trial is testing both Farxiga, which is an SGLT inhibitor, which causes you to pee out glucose, like I mentioned, and also Ozempic, which is a GLP-1 receptor agonist approved for type 2 diabetes. What's really great about both of these drugs is not only do they improve blood sugar, but in non-T1D populations, they've been shown to have lots of other benefits, including reductions in obesity, blood pressure, and then really importantly, heart and kidney health. So we think that these drugs have the potential to improve heart and kidney health in type 1, even beyond what you would expect from their improvements in blood sugar. But those trials have yet to be done, but we're extremely optimistic about them. So, beyond the details of these particular drugs, the point I would want to get across is that we are pushing a paradigm shift in how we think about drug therapy for type 1. Insulin by itself isn't enough. For many diseases, including type 2, there are lots of drugs available, and each patient can go talk to their doctor and figure out what the right therapy or combination of therapies is for them. And we want to get to that point with type 1, where there are multiple drugs, not just insulin by itself, that can be taken safely and conveniently to get the best possible outcomes. So I'm returning now to the cartoon I showed earlier of how you get from laboratory research all the way to clinical adoption and better outcomes. I hope that when I gave some of the examples of things you're working on, you can see how we're pushing projects to the right. We always talk about moving things to the right of the pipeline and bringing them all the way to this goal of better outcomes. And that's the goal by which, the standard by which we evaluate how well we're doing. We need to get people with type 1 better outcomes. And if we're not doing that, then that's really all that matters in the end. So the last point I want to make here is the way we approach our strategy. So we are always building roadmaps that show us how we're going to get to our goals. And the most famous roadmap we ever made was the AP roadmap, which worked fantastically well. We set a vision for the field. The private sector came along with us. The FDA came along with us, and we moved the whole field where we wanted it to be. And I'm not going to go through all of the points here. I just want to make the broader point that for all of our programs, we've built these roadmaps, and you can go on our website and actually look at our strategy and read the roadmaps, and you can understand what our vision is for the field, how we're going to get there, and how we're going to bring everyone else in the field, all the companies and all other stakeholders along with us. So the most important takeaway is that the Improving Lives program is developing drugs, devices, and behavioral health interventions to improve not only clinical outcomes in type 1, but also quality of life. We're doing great in devices. We have 3 hybrid closed loop systems with more coming soon, and we're now building the next generation of AP systems to be even better in terms of user experience and outcomes. We will never stop fighting for people with type 1 diabetes. Improving the lives of people with established disease is a top priority for us. And despite the progress we've made, we're far from complacent. We're going to keep working for this whole community to get to where we want to be. We don't just support individual projects or individual grants. We're always doing everything in a framework of driving the whole field forward. And again, I encourage everyone to check out the roadmaps in our strategy document. Finally, just a reminder that I didn't talk about it today, but we also support therapies for psychosocial health and long-term complications, and those will be coming up in an RIV in the near future. Thank you, everybody, for listening.